The summer of 1950 arrived in Harlem like a fever that wouldn't break, with heat sitting thick and heavy over the streets and turning the asphalt into something soft and sticky while making the air shimmer above the hoods of parked cars like liquid glass. The kind of heat that shortened tempers and lengthened shadows and made men take off their jackets and roll up their sleeves and remember every slight they'd ever swallowed, every insult they'd ever ignored, every moment they'd been forced to. Lowered their eyes and accept humiliation because the alternative was a billy club across the skull or a rope around the neck. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to every soul in Harlem as Bumpy, walked down Lenox Avenue on the afternoon of July 14, 1950, moving through the heat with the easy grace of a man who owned the pavement beneath his feet, and he was 43 years old that summer, released from his most recent prison sentence only 8 months earlier, having spent those 8 months re-establishing the authority that his absence had temporarily disrupted. The numbers operations were running smoothly again, and the protection arrangements with legitimate businesses had been restored, while the Italian families downtown understood after several pointed conversations and to unfortunate incidents that were never officially connected to anyone that Harlem was not territory open for expansion regardless of what they thought they could take while Bumpy had been away. He wore a gray suit that had been tailored on 125th Street by a man who'd learned his trade in London before the Depression brought him to America, looking for work that didn't exist for black craftsmen in the textile districts of Manhattan, and the suit fit perfectly, draping across Bumpy's shoulders without a wrinkle, while tapering at the waist and breaking at exactly the right point above his polished Oxford shoes. His tie was silk, deep burgundy, knotted with military precision, while his shirt was white and starched so crisp it could have cut paper, making him look, as he always looked, like a man who understood that presentation was armor, that clothes were weapons, that appearing successful was half the battle of being successful in a world that wanted nothing more than to see black men fail. But his hair was getting long, not dramatically long or in a way that would be noticed by most people, but long enough that when he looked in the mirror that morning he'd seen the way it was starting to curl at the edges and lose the sharp, clean lines that he maintained as carefully as he maintained his reputation, because a man in Bumpy Johnson's position couldn't afford to look unkempt or give anyone, friend or enemy, the impression that he was slipping, that his attention to detail was wavering, that the machine he'd built was running without proper maintenance. His regular barber, a man named Chester Williams, who'd been cutting hair in Harlem since before the Great War, had closed his shop 2 weeks earlier after a heart attack dropped him dead at 67 years old, while he was sweeping hair off his floor at closing time, and the funeral had been large and well-attended and respectful, with Bumpy sending flowers and a donation to Chester's widow that would keep her comfortable for the rest of her life. But Chester's death had left Bumpy without a barber, and finding a new barber when you were. Bumpy Johnson wasn't as simple as walking into any shop and sitting down in any chair because a barber knew things and heard things, while a man sat in a barber's chair with his throat exposed on a straight razor inches from his carotid artery, and his eyes closed while warm lather was applied in sharp steel, scraped across vulnerable skin, requiring trust and discretion. Bumpy had asked around and made inquiries through channels that connected him to the network of businesses and operators and community leaders who formed the invisible infrastructure of Harlem's economy, but the recommendations had been mixed because some barbers were skilled but indiscreet, while some were loyal and some were available but worked in shops where the clientele was unreliable and maintaining security would be impossible. Then someone, Bumpy later couldn't remember who, mentioned a new shop that had opened 3 months earlier on 138th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue, where the barber's name was Vincent Marconi, an Italian, which was unusual for Harlem, but not unprecedented. And people said Italian barbers had skills because they'd trained in the old country and knew techniques that American barbers didn't know, could give a shave so close and smooth it looked like your face had been polished. The shop was called Marconi's, with a simple name and clean windows, while the barber pole outside spun red and white and blue with the colors bleeding together in the afternoon heat, and Bumpy had walked past it once, 2 days earlier, just to observe, seeing customers inside with black men sitting in chairs getting haircuts and waiting on benches reading newspapers, making the operation look legitimate and professional and exactly like the kind of establishment where a man of Bumpy Johnson stature could get a proper haircut without compromising security or dignity. What Bumpy didn't know, what nobody had mentioned because nobody had noticed, or because those who'd noticed hadn't thought to mention it, was that Vincent Marconi was a man carrying a particular kind of poison in his soul. The kind of poison that had been distilled over generations of being taught that some humans were inherently superior to others, based solely on the color of skin they'd been born into. The kind of poison that allowed a man to smile while taking money from black customers during business hours, while believing deep in his heart that those customers were animals dressed in human clothes, was savages who needed to be tolerated for economic reasons, but who could never be equals. Marconi had opened his shop in Harlem not because he respected the community or wanted to serve it, but because he'd been forced out of Little Italy by other Italian barbers who didn't want competition and who'd made it clear through methods both subtle and explicit that Vincent Marconi was not welcome to operate south of Houston Street. So he'd come to Harlem because he'd calculated, correctly, that black customers had limited options and would accept service from a white barber, even if that barber privately despised them. He'd come to Harlem because he thought he could make money off people he considered inferior, could take their dollars while maintaining his sense of racial superiority, could operate in their neighborhood while never actually acknowledging their humanity. And he'd been doing exactly that for 3 months, taking appointments from black customers and cutting their hair and taking their money, while every night when he closed the shop and walked back to his apartment in a white neighborhood 12 blocks south, he told himself he was better than every person he'd served that day. When Bumpy Johnson pushed open the door to Marconi's barbershop at 2:47 p.m. on July 14, 1950, he had no idea he was walking into the kind of moment that would define not just his own legend, but would become a story that fathers would tell sons, that would be repeated in bars and churches and living rooms for decades, that would serve as a lesson about dignity and power and the precise application of justice when legal systems failed to provide it. The bell above the door chimed with a small brass sound that made a delicate tinkling noise that seemed inappropriate for the heaviness of what was about to unfold. And inside the shop, the air was cooler, moved by 2 large floor fans that oscillated back and forth with a steady mechanical rhythm, while the smell of bay rum and talcum powder hung thick, mixing with the sharper chemical scent of hair tonic and the underlying organic smell of human sweat that no amount of cologne could fully mask. There were 4 barber chairs, old-fashioned chairs with leather seats and chrome fixtures that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and 3 of the chairs were occupied. In the first chair sat a man in his 50s getting a trim with his face hidden behind a newspaper he was reading, while the barber, a young black man who looked nervous even before Bumpy entered, worked carefully with scissors. And in the second chair sat a teenager, maybe 16 years old, getting his first adult haircut, while trying to look confident as his mother watched from the waiting area with an expression that mixed pride and anxiety. In the third chair sat a middle-aged man in working clothes, a dock worker or a construction laborer based on the dirt under his fingernails and the thickness of his hands, getting a full shave with his face covered in white lather, while another young, black barber wielded a straight razor with concentration that bordered on fear. The fourth chair was empty, and standing next to it, while wearing a white barber's coat that looked like a doctor's coat and holding a pair of scissors in one hand and a comb in the other, was Vincent Marconi, a big man over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and thick forearms that showed beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his coat. His hair was black and slicked back, with so much pomade it looked like patent leather, while his face was round and flushed, perpetually red as if he were always angry or always drunk or both, and his eyes were small and dark, set too close together, giving him a look of perpetual suspicion, while his mouth was a thin line that rarely smiled, and when it did, the smile never reached those small dark eyes. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the temperature drop? Felt the atmosphere change? Felt something invisible but undeniable shift in the air? like pressure dropping before a storm, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair on your body stands up and your animal brain screams danger even though your rational mind hasn't yet identified the threat. Because that's exactly what happened when Bumpy Johnson walked through that door and every person in the shop, except Vincent Marconi, understood exactly who had just arrived. Subscribe to Timeless Bosses to understand how power recognizes power, how predators identify other predators, how the most dangerous confrontations often begin with silence rather than sound. Marconi looked at Bumpy, and his eyes traveled from Bumpy's polished shoes to his tailored suit to his crisp white shirt to his face, and in that journey of less than 2 seconds something happened in Marconi's expression where something shifted and something hardened, making his mouth tighten and his jaw clench and his knuckles go white around the scissors he was holding. The 3 barbers, working in the other chairs, noticed Bumpy's entrance, with the nervous young man cutting the older gentleman's hair freezing mid-snip with his scissors hanging in the air, while the barber giving the teenager his haircut stopped moving entirely with his body going rigid, and the man with the straight razor at the dock worker's throat pulled the blade away slowly and carefully, his hands suddenly shaking in a way it hadn't been shaking before, because everyone in that shop, except Vincent Marconi, knew exactly who had just walked through the door, and understood that this was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd walked out of Sing Sing and Alcatraz without his spirit broken, who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz when Dutch Schultz was supposedly untouchable, who'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano and lived to tell about it, who'd built an organization that employed thousands and protected tens of thousands more. Bumpy approached the empty chair and moved with that same easy grace he'd shown on the street, unhurried and unworried, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been refused service in his life, who'd never even considered the possibility that someone might refuse him, and he reached the chair and put his hand on the armrest while preparing to sit down. "We're closed," Marconi said, and the words dropped into the shop like stones into still water, where 2 simple words created ripples that spread through that small space with devastating force. The newspaper in the first customer's hands rustled as his grip tightened, while the teenager in the second chair stopped breathing, and the dock worker with lather on his face opened his eyes, suddenly alert and suddenly aware that something terrible was happening, as the 3 young, black barbers stood frozen with their tools still in their hands, and their faces showing a mixture of horror and disbelief. Bumpy looked at Marconi, and his expression didn't change, didn't harden, didn't show anger or surprise or anything that might give Marconi the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed a blow, as Bumpy simply looked at the man while studying him the way a scientist might study a specimen under a microscope, with clinical detachment, with curiosity about what made this particular organism function. "Your sign says you're open until 6, Bumpy said, and his voice was quiet and calm, the kind of calm that was more frightening than shouting because it suggested control, suggested thought, suggested that whatever response eventually came would be calculated rather than emotional. "We're closed for the day," Marconi repeated while not looking at Bumpy now but looking past him, through him, as if Bumpy were something transparent, something that could be ignored if you simply refused to acknowledge its existence. And he added, "Private appointments only. You need to leave." The teenager's mother in the waiting area made a small sound in her throat, something between a gasp and a whimper, because she knew what was happening, and everyone in that shop knew what was happening, everyone except Marconi, who'd decided that this was the moment he was going to make a stand, was going to demonstrate that even in Harlem, even in this black neighborhood where he'd been forced to operate, he was still a white man, and white men didn't have to serve black men regardless of what suits they wore or what money they carried. "You have 3 customers in chairs right now," Bumpy observed. And he continued, 3 barbers working, 1 empty chair, which suggests to me you're open for business. Not closed for the day. "Those are existing appointments," Marconi said, while setting down his scissors and comb on the counter beside the chair, making a show of finishing his work, of being done for the day regardless of what time the clock showed. And he added, "I don't take walk-ins from everyone who wanders in off the street." Everyone, and the word hung there loaded with implication, dripping with the poison that Marconi carried in his soul. Because he didn't mean everyone, he meant certain kinds of everyone, the kind that looked like Bumpy Johnson. The young barber cutting the older man's hair found his voice thin and terrified, saying, "Mr. Marconi, sir, I can take this gentleman. I'm almost finished here." "I can." "You keep working on your current customer." Marconi cut him off, with his voice sharp as the scissors he'd just set down, and he continued, "I don't pay you to make decisions about who gets served in my shop." "Your shop?" And the possessive was deliberate, a reminder to everyone present that Vincent Marconi owned this space, that he made the rules, that his authority superseded anyone else's preferences or expectations. Bumpy looked around the shop and looked at the 3 young black barbers who were standing there in paralyzed horror, looked at the customers in the chairs who'd stopped breathing, looked at the teenager's mother who was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white, looked at all these people who were witnesses to something that shouldn't be happening, that couldn't be happening, but that was happening right in front of them. Then Bumpy looked back at Marconi, and he smiled. And it wasn't a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made the temperature in the room drop another 10 degrees. The smile of a man who'd just been handed exactly the kind of gift he could use, who'd just been given justification for something he'd been looking for an excuse to do, who'd just watched his opponent make a fatal error in a game. The opponent didn't even know he was playing. "I understand," Bumpy said softly, and he continued, "You don't serve walk-ins from everyone. You're very selective about your clientele, very particular about maintaining certain standards." "That's right," Marconi said while misreading Bumpy's calm as submission and mistaking the smile as acceptance, adding, "I run a quality establishment. Not everyone belongs here." "Not everyone," Bumpy repeated as he nodded slowly, as if considering this philosophy, as if finding it reasonable. And then he said, "That's an interesting business model for a shop in Harlem, excluding potential customers based on characteristics they were born with, rather than their ability to pay. Very Italian of you, Vincent, very old country. The kind of thinking that probably made you very popular downtown before you ended up here." Marconi's face flushed darker, as the mention of downtown, the reference to his forced relocation, touched a nerve, and he said, "I don't have to explain my business practices to you or anyone else. This is private property. I reserve the right to refuse service. Now, I've asked you politely to leave. Don't make me call the police." The police, and the threat was almost comical in its impotence, as if the NYPD would rush to arrest Bumpy Johnson at the complaint of an Italian barber who'd insulted him, as if the police in Harlem, many of whom were on Bumpy's payroll, or who at minimum understood the complex ecosystem of power in the neighborhood, would choose the side of some racist transplant from downtown over the man who actually ran the streets, revealing how little Marconi understood about where he was, about who he was dealing with, about the rules of the world he'd chosen to operate in. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and every person in that shop tensed, with the young barbers backing away from their chairs, and the customers going rigid, and the teenager's mother standing up while preparing to grab her son and run. Because when a man like Bumpy Johnson reached into his jacket after being insulted, after being humiliated, after being told he wasn't good enough to sit in a chair, people expected a gun, expected violence, expected blood. But Bumpy didn't pull out a gun. Instead, he pulled out his wallet, a beautiful wallet made of Italian leather, ironically enough, soft and butter-smooth and expensive. And he opened it carefully and deliberately while making sure everyone in the shop could see the bills inside. Hundreds, multiple hundreds, more money than most people in that shop had ever seen in one place. He pulled out a single $100 bill. Assumed that, in 1950, represented 2 months' rent, a year's worth of haircuts, serious money, and he held it up while letting the light catch it and letting everyone see it. "I'll pay $100, Bumpy said, and he continued, "For a haircut? Right now, in that empty chair, $100 for 20 minutes of your time, Vincent. That's more than you make in a week from all your other customers combined." The shop went silent except for the mechanical oscillation of the fans, and $100 was an absurd amount, an insulting amount in a different way because it demonstrated that Bumpy could pay whatever he wanted. That money wasn't the issue, that Marconi's refusal had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the content of his character. Marconi stared at the bill and his eyes fixed on it, where you could see the calculation happening behind those small dark eyes, see the war between greed and pride, between his desire for money and his commitment to his racist principles, and for a moment, maybe 3 seconds, that felt like 3 hours, it looked like greed might win. Then his jaws set and his eyes hardened and he made his choice, saying, "I said no, put your money away. I don't care if you're offering $1,000. I don't cut hair for your kind. I don't serve your kind. You're not welcome in my shop. Now get out, before I make you get out." Your kind, and he'd said it, had made it explicit, had removed any possibility of misunderstanding and any chance of pretending this was about anything other than race, drawing the line clearly where on one side stood white people who deserved service and on the other side stood black people who didn't, regardless of their money, regardless of their clothes, regardless of their dignity or accomplishment or humanity. Bumpy put the $100 bill back in his wallet and put the wallet back in his jacket pocket, not hurrying or rushing but moving with the same deliberate care he'd shown when taking it out. And then he straightened his tie and adjusted his jacket and looked around the shop, one more time at all the frozen faces staring at him. "I want everyone here to remember this moment," Bumpy said, and his voice was still quiet and still calm, but now it carried something else, authority and finality, the tone of a judge delivering a sentence. As he continued, "I want you to remember that I walked into this shop as a customer with money to spend. I was polite, I was respectful, I followed every social convention, and I was refused service, not because I couldn't pay, not because I was rude, not because I was drunk or disorderly, but because of the color of my skin." He turned to face Marconi directly and said, "And I want you, Vincent Marconi, to remember something very specific. I want you to remember that you had a choice in this moment. You could have taken my $100, you could have given me a haircut, you could have treated me like any other paying customer, but you chose differently. You chose to make this about race. You chose to insult me publicly. You chose to humiliate me in front of witnesses." Bumpy paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped even lower, became almost intimate, as if he were sharing a secret, saying, "In 3 days, Vincent, you're going to understand that the worst mistakes are the ones we make when we think we're in control. In 3 days, you're going to wish you'd taken the $100. He turned and walked toward the door while the bell chimed as he pushed it open, letting the heat of the afternoon rush in heavy and oppressive. And Bumpy stepped out onto the sidewalk with the door swinging shut behind him, leaving the barbershop in stunned silence. Inside, Marconi laughed, with a forced sound that was loud and aggressive, meant to demonstrate that he wasn't intimidated, that he'd won the confrontation, that he'd successfully defended his shop against invasion, and he said to the room, "Did you hear that? 3 days. What's he gonna do in 3 days? These people think they're so tough. They're nothing but talk." Nothing but the young barber who'd offered to cut Bumpy's hair interrupted him with his voice barely above a whisper, asking, "Mr. Marconi, do you know who that was?" "I don't care who it was," Marconi snapped. Continuing, "Could have been the mayor of Harlem, for all I care. This is my shop. I don't have to serve anyone I don't want to serve." That was Bumpy Johnson, the teenager in the second chair said with his voice cracking on the words, adding, "That was Bumpy Johnson and you just, the teenager couldn't finish the sentence and didn't need to, because everyone in the shop understood what Marconi had just done. Everyone except Marconi himself, who was still operating under the delusion that being white in America meant you were untouchable even when you were operating in a black neighborhood, even when you'd just insulted the most powerful black man in that neighborhood, even when you'd done it in front of witnesses who would talk, and talk they did, because by nightfall everyone in Harlem knew what had happened at Marconi's barbershop, and by the next morning the story had spread to the Bronx and Brooklyn, while by the afternoon of the second day people were placing bets on what Bumpy would do, on when it would happen, on how public the response would be. But Bumpy did nothing, not that day or the next day, as business continued as usual with the numbers runners making their collections and the policy banks operating smoothly and the protection arrangements staying in place, while Bumpy was seen at the Flash and having dinner and at the Savoy Ballroom watching the dancers and conducting business exactly as he always conducted business. Calm and professional and seemingly unconcerned with a racist barber who'd insulted him, which made everyone more nervous, not less, because the people who knew Bumpy Johnson understood that his calm wasn't acceptance but was planning, was strategy, was the terrible patience of a man who understood that revenge served hot was satisfying, but revenge served cold, was devastating. On the evening of July 16th, 48 hours after the barbershop incident, Vincent Marconi closed his shop at 6 p.m. as usual and cleaned the floors and sanitized his tools and locked the cash register. That had been lighter than usual because some customers had canceled appointments, had decided that maybe they'd get their hair cut somewhere else, had voted with their feet even though no one had explicitly told them to boycott Marconi's shop. It just happened organically the way communities protect themselves without needing orders or organization. Marconi walked out the front door and locked it behind him and started the 12-block walk to his apartment, with the evening heat barely less oppressive than the afternoon heat, and the streets were full of people trying to escape their apartments, sitting on stoops and gathering on corners and playing music and drinking and laughing, living the kind of street life that made Harlem feel alive in ways that downtown Manhattan never felt. Marconi walked with his head down while avoiding eye contact and moving quickly through streets where he'd never felt welcome, where he knew he was tolerated but not accepted, where his white skin marked him as an outsider in a neighborhood that had every reason to be hostile to outsiders, who looked like the people who'd been oppressing them for centuries. He was 2 blocks from his apartment when he noticed them, 4 men, young men in their early 20s, well-dressed but not fancy, standing on the corner while not doing anything but just standing and watching. Marconi crossed the street, but the 4 men crossed with him while maintaining the same distance, not approaching but not leaving either, following and definitely following. Marconi walked faster as his heart started pounding, knowing he was a big man who was strong and could handle himself in a fight, but 4 against 1 were bad odds, and he wasn't carrying anything for self-defense, because he'd learned early that carrying weapons in Harlem drew attention from police who were looking for excuses to arrest white people who didn't belong. He reached his building, a 3-story walk-up that was working class and nothing fancy, and he fumbled with his keys while his hands suddenly shook, got the door open and rushed inside and slammed it behind him. And through the window he could see the 4 men standing across the street now, still watching and still waiting. Marconi climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment and got inside and locked the door and locked the deadbolt and put the chain on, then went to the window and looked down to see the 4 men were still there. And now there were more of them. 8 men, 10 men, just standing and watching his building, not threatening and not moving, but just present, a silent reminder that they knew where he lived, that they could be there whenever they wanted, that his home was no longer the sanctuary he'd thought it was. Vincent Marconi didn't sleep that night as he sat in his apartment with all the lights off while peering through the curtains every 20 minutes, watching the street below, where the men remained until sometime after 3 a.m., when they finally dispersed like smoke, leaving the corner empty but not safe, because their absence felt more threatening than their presence had been, making him keep the lights off because turning them on would have meant admitting he was home, admitting he was scared, admitting that something he'd done had created consequences he hadn't anticipated. At dawn, exhausted and wired on fear and adrenaline, Marconi made the walk back to his shop where the same men weren't on the corners, but different men were there, younger and older with different faces but the same message. And they watched him pass without speaking or threatening, just acknowledging his presence with looks that made his skin crawl. Looks that suggested they knew something he didn't know yet, that whatever was coming hadn't arrived but was inevitable. The shop looked normal from the outside, where the windows were intact and the door was locked exactly as he'd left it. But when Marconi opened the door and stepped inside, he found that everything had changed in ways both subtle and devastating, because all 3 of his employees were gone. The 3 young black barbers who'd worked for him since he opened hadn't shown up for work, and their stations were clean while their tools were missing and their smocks were folded neatly on their chairs as if they'd simply evaporated in the night. On Marconi's chair, the empty 4th chair where he worked, sat a single envelope that was white and unsealed with no name on it. Inside was a typewritten letter on good paper that was professional and formal, like something a lawyer would write, saying, "Dear Mr. Marconi, we regret to inform you that we will no longer be able to provide our services to your establishment. This decision is effective immediately and is final. We thank you for the opportunity to work in your shop, but have found other employment that better aligns with our professional values and community commitments. We wish you success in your future endeavors. And the letter was signed by all 3 barbers. Marconi crumpled the letter and threw it across the shop because they'd quit, all 3 at once, which meant someone had gotten to them, had offered them other jobs, had made it clear that continuing to work for Vincent Marconi was no longer acceptable, which meant Marconi was now operating a 4-chair barbershop completely alone, unable to serve multiple customers simultaneously, unable to maintain the volume of business that made the rent payments possible. But customers still existed, he told himself. Customers who needed haircuts. Customers who'd been coming to his shop for 3 months and who had no reason to stop just because of some incident that most of them probably didn't even know about. And he could handle the reduced capacity, could work longer hours, could make it work until he found new employees who were willing to overlook whatever campaign of intimidation Bumpy Johnson was running. The first appointment was scheduled for 8 a.m. A regular customer named Thomas, who worked as a postal carrier and always came in on Wednesday mornings before his shift. But Thomas didn't show up, and at 8:15 Marconi called Thomas's home, where a woman answered, probably Thomas's wife. "He won't be coming to your shop anymore," she said with her voice cold, adding, "He's found a new barber." "But he's been coming here for months," Marconi protested, saying, "I'm holding the slot for him. If he's going to cancel, he needs to." The woman hung up. Just hung up mid-sentence, with the dial tone buzzing in Marconi's ear like an insect. The 9 o'clock appointment cancelled, and the 10 o'clock appointment called to say he'd found more convenient service elsewhere, while the 11 o'clock simply never showed. And by noon, Marconi had serviced exactly 0 customers and had received 7 cancellation calls. And by 2 p.m. he was sitting alone in an empty shop with the oscillating fans pushing around air that smelled like bay rum and failure. Have you ever watched a business die in real time? Watched a livelihood evaporate not through legal action or official sanctions, but through the simple, coordinated withdrawal of community support, through the quiet decision of thousands of people to simply look away, to take their money elsewhere, to let someone starve without ever raising a hand against them, because that's what true power looks like when it's wielded collectively. Like this video if you understand that the most powerful weapon isn't violence, but silence, isn't force but coordination, isn't aggression but the systematic removal of cooperation that makes survival possible. At 3 p.m. the landlord arrived, Mr. Harold Chun, a Chinese immigrant who owned the building and several others on the block, and he knocked on the locked front door where Marconi let him in, while grateful for any human interaction, even if it was just the landlord collecting rent that wasn't due for another 2 weeks. But Mr. Chun wasn't there to collect rent. He was there to deliver a message, saying, "I'm very sorry, Mr. Marconi, but I need you to vacate the premises. I'm terminating your lease." "You can't terminate my lease," Marconi said with panic rising in his throat. Continuing, "I have a contract. I paid first and last month's rent. You can't just..." Section 7, paragraph 3 of your lease agreement. Chun interrupted while pulling out a copy of the contract from his briefcase. Reading, "The landlord reserves the right to terminate the lease with 30 days' notice if the tenant's business activities create disturbances that affect other tenants or damage the landlord's relationship with the community." "What disturbances?" Marconi demanded, asking. "I run a barbershop. It's quiet. There's no noise. There's no... Your business has created community concerns," Chun said carefully while choosing his words, with the precision of a man who'd been coached on exactly what to say. Continuing, "Multiple community members have expressed to me that your presence is problematic, that your business practices are discriminatory, that allowing you to continue operating in this location reflects poorly on me as a landlord and creates tensions that I'm not willing to manage." "Who told you this?" Marconi asked, though he already knew the answer, demanding, "Who complained?" "That's not relevant," Chun said. Continuing, "What's relevant is that I'm exercising my contractual right to terminate your lease. You have 30 days to remove your property. If you wish to dispute this, you're welcome to retain legal counsel and challenge the termination in court, but I've been advised that such a challenge would be unsuccessful given the documentation I have regarding community concerns and your violation of anti-discrimination principles." "I didn't violate anything," Marconi insisted, saying, "I have the right to refuse service, private property, private business. I can serve whoever I want." "Perhaps," Chun said, while closing his briefcase, adding, "But I also have private property and I can rent to whoever I want, and I've decided I don't want to rent to you anymore. 30 days, Mr. Marconi. Please be out by August 16th. Chun left, and the door closed behind him with the same delicate chiming of the bell that had announced Bumpy Johnson's arrival 2 days earlier, leaving Marconi standing in the empty shop, while surrounded by 4 chairs that would never be filled again, in a space that was already starting to feel like a tomb. But the worst part, the part that made his stomach turn and his hands shake, was that he knew this wasn't over. Knew that losing his employees and his customers and his lease was just the beginning. Because Bumpy Johnson had said 3 days, and it was only day 2. That night the men returned to his building with more of them this time, 20 or maybe 30, spread across the block while standing in doorways and sitting on stoops and smoking cigarettes, and talking quietly among themselves, not threatening or approaching but just present. A wall of witnesses, a reminder that everything Marconi did was being observed, that his life was no longer private, that he existed now in a spotlight he couldn't escape. At midnight, someone knocked on his apartment door, where Mark, who'd been sitting in darkness with a kitchen knife on his lap because he didn't own a gun and wouldn't have known how to use one effectively anyway, froze as the knock came again, polite and almost gentle. "Mr. Marconi," a voice called through the door, saying, "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to deliver a message. I'm going to slide something under your door. I'd appreciate if you'd read it." Marconi watched as a piece of paper appeared under the door gap and slid across his floor, coming to rest near his feet, and he waited 5 minutes while listening for sounds in the hallway and hearing nothing before finally picking up the paper. It was a handwritten note on the same kind of good paper the typed letter had been on, with handwriting that was elegant and educated, the letters formed with the kind of precision that came from practice and care. "Vincent, by now you understand that your business in Harlem is finished, your employees are gone, your customers are gone, your landlord wants you out. And this is what happens when you mistake tolerance for acceptance, when you confuse temporary civility for permanent welcome, when you believe that your whiteness gives you authority in a neighborhood that doesn't belong to you. You had a choice. You could have cut my hair. You could have taken my $100. You could have treated me like a human being. But you chose to make it about race. You chose to assert dominance. You chose to humiliate me in front of witnesses. So now I'm teaching you a lesson that you'll carry for the rest of your life. Because power in Harlem doesn't come from the color of your skin. It comes from the respect you earn from the community you serve. And you have no respect here. None. Tomorrow is day 3, and I suggest you use it to pack your things and leave. Because if you're still here on day 4, if you're still trying to operate your business in my neighborhood after being asked politely to leave, the consequences will become less polite. And this is not a threat, but education. So consider yourself schooled. Respectfully, E.R. Johnson. Marconi read the note 3 times, as his hands shook so badly the paper rattled, making the knife on his lap suddenly seem absurd. A child's toy brought to a professional battlefield, because he was dealing with something beyond his experience and beyond his understanding. And this wasn't street violence, or a mugging, or a beating, or the kind of simple physical danger he'd been bracing for. This was systematic dismantling. This was being erased from existence through the coordinated withdrawal of every support structure that made life in the city possible. He didn't sleep again that night as he sat in darkness and watched the dawn light slowly fill his apartment while making his decision. On July 17, 1950, exactly 3 days after refusing to cut Bumpy Johnson's hair, Vincent Marconi loaded his Barber supplies into his car and drove to his shop and removed his personal belongings and left Harlem forever. Not saying goodbye to anyone, or trying to negotiate with his landlord, or attempting to salvage his business or his reputation, just simply leaving because he understood that staying would mean enduring consequences he couldn't survive. The barbershop remained empty for 2 weeks, and then a new sign appeared in the window saying, "Chester's second location, grand opening, Augustuno Sen," where Chester Williams's widow had used the donation from Bumpy Johnson to open a second location of her late husband's shop, and she hired 3 young barbers who'd recently become available, and business was excellent from day 1. Bumpy Johnson got his haircut there on August 2nd, where the entire shop treated him like royalty. Not because they were afraid of him, though fear was certainly present, but because he'd demonstrated something important. He'd shown that dignity mattered and that respect mattered. That when legal systems failed to protect people from discrimination, then alternative systems would emerge. And those alternative systems could be more effective than any law because they operated through community consensus rather than government enforcement. Years later, when people asked Bumpy about the barbershop incident, about what he'd done to Vincent Marconi, he'd smile that same cold smile he'd shown in the shop and say something that became another legendary quote in the constellation of Bumpy Johnson wisdom. "I didn't do anything to him," Bumpy would say, continuing. "I simply let the community know what kind of man he was, and what happened after that was their choice. I just provided the information, and they provided the justice." The story of Vincent Marconi and the barbershop became something larger than just one racist getting run out of Harlem. It became a lesson taught to every business owner who tried to operate in the neighborhood. It became a warning to anyone who thought they could take black people's money while denying them basic respect. It became proof that economic power, when wielded collectively, could be more devastating than any gun. The spot where Marconi's shop had been became a landmark where older residents would point it out to younger people and tell the story of the day Bumpy Johnson walked in, asking for a haircut, and walked out having delivered a sentence that took 3 days to execute but lasted forever in its impact. Have you ever witnessed justice delivered, not through courts or laws or official sanctions, but through the simple, coordinated decision of an entire community to stop cooperating with someone who'd violated their standards, to stop providing the social and economic infrastructure that makes life possible, to let someone discover that isolation is a punishment more severe than any physical violence could be? Because that's exactly what happened when Bumpy Johnson taught Vincent Marconi that in Harlem, respect wasn't negotiable, and dignity couldn't be denied. Subscribe to Timeless Bosses to understand how real power operates through community consensus, how institutions can be built or destroyed through collective will, how the most effective revolutions happen not through dramatic confrontations, but through systematic withdrawal of support. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1950, after getting his hair cut at Chester's second location, Bumpy Johnson stood on the corner of 138th Street and Lenox Avenue, where he looked at the empty storefront where Marconi's shop had been, and the barber pole was gone, and the windows were papered over, and the space was dead. A young man approached him, mid-20s and working class, someone Bumpy had seen around but didn't know personally, and the young man stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Johnson," the young man said. Continuing, "I was in Marconi's shop that day. I saw what happened. I saw what he did to you, and," Bumpy asked, "and I just wanted to say thank you." The young man said, continuing, "For not letting it stand. For showing us that we don't have to accept disrespect just because someone white thinks they can give it. For teaching us that power doesn't come from violence, but comes from organization." Bumpy looked at the young man and saw in his face the faces of thousands of other young black men in Harlem who'd been raised to lower their eyes, to accept humiliation, to swallow pride because fighting back seemed impossible. And he saw the beginnings of something different, something harder to suppress, something that understood collective power. "What's your name, son?" "Bumpy Askett." "Malcolm," the young man said, continuing. "Malcolm Little. People call me Red because of my hair." Bumpy nodded and extended his hand, where Malcolm shook it with his grip firm and his eyes direct. And Bumpy said, "You remember what you saw, Malcolm? Remember that the system is only as strong as people's willingness to cooperate with it. And when people stop cooperating, when they withdraw their consent, when they say no all at once, there's no force that can compel them, and that's real power. That's the power that changes the world." Malcolm nodded, and something in his eyes suggested he understood that the lesson was being absorbed, that seeds were being planted that would flower in ways Bumpy couldn't predict, but would certainly recognize when they bloomed. Bumpy Johnson walked away from that corner with his hair freshly cut and his dignity intact and his legend enhanced, leaving behind him an empty storefront that stood as a monument to a lesson delivered with surgical precision. No violence and no arrests, and no legal action. Just the systematic removal of community support until a man who thought he was untouchable discovered he was nothing but air. That's what Bumpy Johnson did that left every customer frozen. Not rage or violence or the expected explosion of anger that racists anticipate and prepare for. Just cold and calculated and coordinated justice that proved intelligence beats force, that patience beats passion, and that dignity defended collectively is more powerful than any individual act of defiance. The barbershop remained empty for 6 months until Chester's expanded into it, where the space became successful and thrived, and served the community for decades. And every barber who ever worked there knew the story, knew that the space had been claimed not through violence, but through the coordinated withdrawal of an entire community's cooperation. That's power, real power. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that operates through collective will rather than individual force. The kind that Bumpy Johnson wielded with precision and patience in a moment when lesser men would have thrown punches and solved nothing. 3 days, that's all it took. 3 days to teach a lesson that Vincent Marconi carried for the rest of his life, wherever he went and whatever he did. 3 days to demonstrate that in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's word was law not because he was violent, but because the community trusted his judgment and followed his lead. And when people asked why, everyone stood frozen in that barbershop when Bumpy smiled and walked out. The answer was simple. They were frozen because they understood they'd just witnessed history. They'd seen the moment when a man who thought he held all the cards discovered that the game was rigged against him from the start, that the house always wins, and that in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was the house.